May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. I asked that we would read that whole chapter of Genesis this morning, not to put you to sleep or to, test your patience, but because I wanted us to hear this refrain. God saw everything that God made, and indeed it was good. God created lands and waters, and indeed it was good. God created plants and trees, animals and birds, fish and humans, and indeed it was good. It was good. It was good. It was good. This connecting thread through all of creation was good. And yet, when we look at all the struggles in the world around us, we know and we see that the world is not always being treated with reverence and care that something that is that good deserves. This morning we're continuing in our fall series called A Little Bit More Heaven, and we're looking today specifically at the care for creation. Care for the soil, care for the water, care for our food systems and air quality, care for the ozone layer and the ice caps, care for all the living beings in this ecosystem, which is everyone and everything. And we're remembering here this morning that woven into that rhythm of creation, that rhythm of goodness, is indeed our own faith journey, our own spiritual lives. Within that story of creation, within the Swedenborgian tradition, we are taught that that is the unfolding and the evolution of our own moving from selfishness to selflessness, moving from believing that we are all alone and in it alone to knowing and believing that we are in it together, interconnected in a way that is good. That passage from Secrets of Heaven that we heard this morning says, nothing unconnected ever occurs, for anything unconnected instantly perishes. Just think about that. Nothing unconnected. All of that goodness that weaves its way around is all connected. And as soon as that is broken, it all perishes. And so we can think of these thoughts kind of abstractly, but think about the physical consequences and reality of when we disconnect. When we disconnect from knowing that we are part of this bigger interconnected web of creation, when we start making choices that are just for ourselves in our own little world over here, that something actually perishes. Something is broken. And that the truth is that in that goodness, we are all connected, and the choices that each of us make actually make a difference. I like to use the example of pulling on one thread. If you think of all of creation as this interconnected web, you pull on one thread. Did you ever play that game in middle school where you take the ball of yarn and you stand in a circle and you're usually meeting people, right? And you're like, okay, if you have an older sibling, then you throw the yarn to them. And then if you like, bananas and you throw the yarn to them, pretty soon you have this messy web that's connecting all the people. And then the leader says, okay, now you over there pull on the thread. And you see like a spider web or something that the whole interconnected web that you just created gets jiggled. So we think about pulling on one thread. Say we just pull on a thread of how our food and how our food connects us. So we all need to eat. We all need food to be grown. And so all of a sudden the soil matters. The water matters. The climate matters, and whether we're having a drought or whether we're having flooding. Throughout time, wars have been fought over access to food because things are changing in the interconnected world of the land and the water and the food. So it's just one example of how this reliance on the earth is something we share with not only all human beings, but also animals and plants and organisms, that the air and the water are absolutely necessary for all of our survival. And so when we talk about care for the earth, and we're invited into this conversation about caring for all that God has created, and this connection and the care for the earth is not something for an isolated environmentalist group to do over here, or just that moment when you realize, oh yes, I need to recycle, but it's actually integrated into all that we are doing and being. We're exploring the life and legacy of Helen Keller here at the chapel. And as an activist and an advocate for human rights of all kinds, she saw care for the earth as something that rose out of her faith and a call to care for all of creation. In a speech that she gave in South Africa in 1951, she said, "By faith." So interesting. This passage that we pulled out on how to care for the earth starts with "by faith." By faith, I mean a vision of good one cherishes, and the enthusiasm that pushes one to seek its fulfillment regardless of the obstacles. Reverence for the beauty and the preciousness of earth, and a sense of responsibility to all. We can to do all we can to make it, the earth, a habitation of health and plenty for all people. Reverence for the beauty and preciousness of the earth, and a sense of responsibility to do all we can do to make it a habitation of health and plenty for all people. Think about these words, reverence and responsibility. I don't think this is always how we approach the earth. I know I don't always approach it that way. And so, in fact, often we can quickly fall into the idea that the earth is actually just here to serve us. It's something that we can pull metals and petroleum out of. It's something that we can grow our food in the soil and grow it in ways that strip the soil, and after a while it can't even grow our food effectively. It's easy for us to think that the earth is here for us as human beings, and that any kind of care or reciprocity is beyond us. There are many reasons for this, of course, going back to what the internal sense of the creation story talks about, which is that we are selfish and that we are looking towards ourselves. And even in the larger world, sometimes this behavior of thinking the earth is all for us comes from this very passage in the book of Genesis. Did you hear that word where it said humans have dominion over the earth? This has often created a human-centric relationship where if humans have dominion, then it's up to us to use it however we want. The words in Genesis have often been translated this way and used to justify our lack of care, are used in opposition to Helen Keller's call for reverence and responsibility. But luckily, there are people who are looking at the Hebrew and saying, I don't think we got that quite right. Dr. Gil Waddleking of Gettysburg Seminary describes this as a difference between the word dominion and domination. He argues that people have been using this word dominion and they're thinking of it in terms of domination. We are to dominate the earth. But he says, no, the word dominion is what is in Scripture, and it goes along with that humans are called to till and to keep the earth, to care for, to nourish, to nurture, that we're actually called to be benevolent stewards, and that climate change and ocean degradation and mountaintop removal, those are the fruits of domination, not dominion. Those are divided from that sense of stewardship and that sense of wonder. And it's only when we can open our eyes to that reverence, to that beauty, and take on the responsibility to care, that we are then actually fulfilling this command and fulfilling this promise. As my colleague, Reverend Sam Chamberlain, points out, this narrative in Genesis 1 is set as a liturgy. It's set as a rhythm of worship, which it means its intent is to shape the hearts of a community attempting to live life together. It's intended to form, not to inform. Among its lessons is the original and most immediate reality that creation is from the hand of God. The origin of the environment is the divine. And immediately, the community of faith is called to look upon the created order as wondrous. In that very creation story, humans are engaged in this circle, in this interconnection, as ones who look with wonder and reverence, and ones who are responsible to care. As Emanuel Swedenborg said, all things are full of God, and all take their portion from that fullness. That goodness that is infused at the beginnings of creation continues to call us forward now. So, what happens when we shift from that place of selfishness and it's all about us, and we look and say, oh, there's this earth that we are responsible for being part of and caring for, and we start to look out and we see all the brokenness. I don't know about you, but I get really overwhelmed. And I get sad, and I get angry, and I look at the effects on the earth around us, and the people, and the soil, and I can get into any one of these areas, and we could go into deep sadness and lament. And I think there's a place for that, because a part of our responsibility is to see how are we part of this equation. But I also think that we can't stop there. We can't get stuck there. And so I want to lift up today just a few people, our dear Helen Keller among them, who keep calling us to see the realities of the brokenness of the world and then to move forward, to do the next thing. So I want to share briefly a story that of a woman who I think Helen Keller would have been good friends with had they lived in the same time and place. This is the story of Wangari Maathai, who lived under an umbrella of green trees in the shadow of Mount Kenya in East Africa. If anyone wants to look at the pictures as we go along, you are welcome to. I'm not just gonna put it there, I'm gonna pass it around because it's much more fun to see pictures. So Wangari Maathai lived under the umbrella of the green trees in the shadow of Mount Kenya in East Africa, and when she was a child, she watched the birds in the forest where she and her mother would go to gather firewood for cooking. She helped harvest sweet potatoes and sugarcane and maize from the rich soil. She showed in school, and she won a scholarship to study in the United States. And 6 years later, she returned to her Kenyan home and she saw a change. The trees that she had grown up playing under were all cut down. And she noticed that the women who used to gather the wood for their cooking fires right there in their neighborhood were walking miles, and their backs were bent from hauling firewood. And she saw barren land and no crops could grow. Thousands and thousands and thousands of trees had been cut down to make room for buildings, and no one had planted new trees in their place. In this particular rendition of the story, her voice is reflected wondering, will all of Kenya become a desert? As her tears began to fall. She went on thinking about that barren land, and she thought, well, I can begin to replace some of the lost trees right here in my backyard and in my neighborhood. So she started with 9 seedlings. Just want you to get that number in your head. 9 seedlings. This feels to me like just those few little things, those little choices. Okay, I can do something. 9 seedlings. So watching those 9 seedlings grow inspired her to take plant more, and then to make a nursery, and then to start sharing them with the women in her village. And then the word got out, and they started sharing them to the women in the next village, and the next village. She set up a system where she would have, if you could keep a seedling alive for 3 months, that she gathered some funds and she would start paying people for keeping them alive for 3 months. Sometimes this was the first income women had ever received. And it began to spread like a green belt stretching out over the land. So reportedly there were people in the government, and people would laugh and say, women can't do this, it takes a trained forester to plant trees. And the women said, okay, let's see. Then the word traveled, and soon cities and towns throughout Kenya are planting long rows of seedlings. She put her own body on the line at times, standing in front of giant oak trees that were wanting to be cut down. She was jailed. She got out again, she kept going, and she might have felt at times like she was alone, that it was just her doing this work. And yet, out across the neighborhoods, across the country, hundreds and then thousands of people were joining her in planting trees, until over 3 million, 3 million trees were planted. And now if you go to the top of Mount Kenya, you look out and you see the tree-covered area. You see people having firewood for the cooking fires. The soil has been replenished. The water is no longer running off. Because one woman planted 9 seedlings and didn't stop there. Our dear Helen Keller once famously put it this way: I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something, and because I cannot do everything, listen to that, because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can. We can't do everything. Each one of us alone can't change all the problems that are needed in order to care for our creation, but we can do something. And because we can do something, we are called to do it, to do that something. And this, I believe, is our part of this interconnected web of creation. All this creation that is good is to do the things we can do, individually, as a church, as a community. It's in the simple practices, the daily choices we make. It's in coming together to work for that more just and generous world. It's in doing what we can to have reverence and responsibility to care for our earthly home. And this, I believe, is that call for the new heaven and the new earth. This is that vision we see at the end of the book of Revelation, when right there in the middle of the heavenly city, there's the river of the water of life. There's this water that nourishes, and this tree of life with 12 kinds of fruit, all kinds of food for all people, and leaves that heal the nations. This heavenly way of being is available to us right now in this moment, with each choice that we make, with in a mind of the care and the well-being of all. That we ask ourselves, is this part of bringing a little more heaven here on earth? And then with God's blessing, as we choose that way of goodness, that way of heaven, that way of love, and we hear and believe that God is with us and saying, yes, and it is good.